Um, yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. So, before we dive into today's session, I'd like to take a moment to express my gratitude. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to Madhusudan and the entire Proshore team for organizing this fantastic event. And the effort for bringing all the QA team members in the same place has been greatly appreciated. And now allow me to introduce myself. So my name is Pibal Pant, and currently I'm working as a QA engineer for House. I'm honored to be your speaker today. So with over 4 years of experience in multiple domains, I have met with fantastic people and new industry trends, and I'm really happy to share my knowledge, my experience with you guys. So throughout my career, I have been passionate about QA automation and leveraging various automation tools such as Cypress, WebDriver IO, Playwright to its maximum efficiency and to improve the quality work in software testing. So without any further ado, I would like to start today's session. Yeah, so just a minute, I'm sharing my screen. Yeah. Cool. So today's session, Cypress automation best practices. So as we all know, there are lots of tools and technologies in our market that QA can leverage, that QA can use to to ease their work, right? So as we all know, there are different automation tools such as Cypress, Playwright, but the implementation of each and every one is different. The approach to implementation to make sure we are using it efficiently is quite different. So at the same time, the uses of automation tool has enabled us to get the product to the market without any delay, and we are ensuring a top quality has been delivered to the client and end users. So today I'll be sharing you some simple and practical insights on how we can improve our Cypress testing process and make it more efficient. And at the same time, also I'll explain about the few of the suggestions that we can include for our automation practices. So without any further ado, I'll start this session. So in this session, I have just identified key areas where we can improve our automation. So this might be, these practices might have already been followed and these might not have been followed. So I hope you will enjoy it. So I'll start without any delay. So the first one is page URL. So as a QA engineer, while performing automation testing, we come across verifying different URLs. We need to make sure, like, whenever we are redirected to a different place or different page, we are at the exact place that we want to. So in order to make sure we keep on using different types of URL, we try to check. So on the examples you have seen, cy.url include QA login. So here we are making sure, like, after redirection, we are going to the particular URL. But many of the times, what we do is we keep on writing it in a hard coding way rather than doing it in a dynamic way, right? So in order to achieve a constant approach where we can make it more consistent, we can use a constant file or a fixtures file, and we can reuse all the page URL and keep it in a one place and reuse it multiple places. So as you can see in example, so here we are trying to check for the URL QA/login properly. Once the user has properly done some testing and he wants to make sure, like, he has been able to log into that particular website or not. So instead of hard coding all the data, we can keep it in a constant file and we can call it in the test specs, whatever is required. So as we can see, cy.url should include page url.qa login. So the same QA login can be used multiple places. Rather than writing same assertions 10 different places, we can keep it in one place, and that updation will happen in other places. So it makes a life a lot easier when you are doing hot picks, and we need to make sure, like, CI deployment is not blocked. And we need to make sure, like, in the growing world, we are able to make sure our automation spec is working fine with 100% status rate. So the following this practice would make sure, like, we are giving consistent automation results to the team. Now, the second one is user credentials in Cypress. So many of the times, so what we do is whenever we are trying to do login or whenever we try to use any emails, we try to hard code it within the test specs. So rather than doing that, so what we can do is we can just simply keep it in a constant file where we can manage all the users. So there can be a role or users based on the role. There can be an admin user, there can be a normal user, there can be some other different types of users. So all those users can be managed in a single place rather than writing it every test file. So suppose you have 10 different test files. Now you are writing 10 different users in 10 different places. And in future, if you need to update the users, then you have to update in 10 different places, which becomes a hectic. So rather than doing that, what we can do is we can have constant file. So in that constant file, we can use Cypress fixtures as well. No issues with that. So when we are using constant file, we can simply declare the users that we want. And if it is a role based, we can add the roles as well. And we can simply recall that particular credentials or maybe constants wherever we want. So the advantage of doing that is, suppose at later point of time, you don't want that particular user, you want to go with the new users. Now we can simply update the constant and that particular changes will be reflected in all the places. So the advantage is basically a one point of contact where changes will be reflected at all places, but the changes will be done in only one place. So it saves a lot of time, and at the same time, maintainability and readability is also increased. Now coming to the third one. So I have found this in most of the companies. So the selector management in Cypress is not properly followed, right? So many of the times whenever we are writing Cypress test specs, we simply write cy.get and do whatever actions we want to do. Maybe we want to do click actions, we want to do type actions. So we just simply write it in the test specs and we just run it. So that is not the practical approach, because the same selectors have to be used in multiple places. It's not like only one time it will be used. So it's not the case. So the same selectors has to be called in different places. Now, suppose you want to do some, there is a pop-up or there is a top-up or any modal is there. So that modal might be might be present in all the pages, right? So instead of writing that particular pop-up or modal in 10 different specs, what we can do is we can create one common page, common class, and keep all the selectors in the same place. Now we can reuse that same specs, we can reuse that same particular selector in multiple places. So as you can see in example, the example is the Cypress one example. That is the basic example that we use. So we have created one method that is enter username input, and we are passing the selector and we are doing the actions. Now what the problem with that is, you will not be able to reuse that particular selector. Now, if you need to do some clear username input, or you want to do some other actions with the input, username input, then you have to again write the selectors, so which increases the chances of duplicacy. And at the same time, with the growing trend, so we keep on updating our class name, we keep on updating our selectors. So whenever the selectors is updated, we need to update it in different places. So to resolve this problem, what we can do is we can create one common page class, so where we will separate all the selectors in a single place, and we'll use this method. So the suggested one source, the enter username input, I have used the same selector for entering the input as well as clearing the input field. Now again, I can do it for the other operations as well. So this way we can reuse the same selectors. We can write it once and use it multiple places. So this is one of the best practices where we can minimize our effort and we can quickly release a hotfix or do any kind of changes we want. Implementing a logger in POM-based Cypress. So basically in POM-based Cypress, what happens is what is a page object model is basically we are segregating the selectors and the actions that we're trying to do, right? And in POM-based Cypress, so we try to create a class, we write some selectors, we write some actions, and we recall that in particular specs. So, but many of the times when we are running it in the Jenkins, or maybe we are running it in the selectors in the Cypress test runner, we won't be able to identify which particular method or which particular class and which method has been called. So that creates a confusion as to debugging the test cases. Suppose we find some failure, then we need to check every line of code and or maybe use Cypress test runner to identify which case. That is in case of open-headed mode. If we are doing it in headless mode, or if we are doing it in Jenkins, we won't be able to get those kind of logs. So the best practices would be using a page-based logger, which will log all the methods that is being called. So I'll show you an example. So this is before implementation of page object model. As you can see, the transaction, before each hook is executing some commands, and then test body is being executed. But we are not getting any idea as to which particular class or from where this method has been called, right? Now, if we are implementing page object model, we'll get some clarification as to, okay, the page object model has called a login page class, and validate sign-in page method has been called. So suppose in future, there has been a change in the selector with the login button. Now, whenever I encounter such problem, then it will trigger an issue like the page class click login method has been failed. So I can simply identify, okay, I need to go to the login page, and inside the login page, the click login selector has been outdated. I need to update that. So it's really make it simple for updating the selectors. So it's really important if you are using a page object model, we should always use page object loggers to make sure we are capturing the proper class and the proper methods that is being called. So naming conventions. So I feel with my experience, I've come across different organizations, and many of the organizations, they use camel case, Pascal case. So that's not a problem, but we should have uniformity as to what we are going to use. We should not try to use Pascal case, camel case at the same time, because it creates a confusion. There has been a naming convention that has been suggested by Cypress as well as development team during the development phase, right? So suppose we are creating a file name, then the file name should be created either using Pascal case or the camel case. So basically the Pascal case is writing the first letter would be the capital, followed by another name would also be the capital. And if you are using camel case, all the letters will be small letters. So what is the advantage of writing this is it maintains uniformity. And at the same time, suppose one QA member is working in another project and he wants to check how this automation is working. So it increases the readability for that QA team. You won't have confusion as to, okay, so if it is Pascal case or camel case, it is a file name. If it is a camel case, it is a variable name. So whenever we are finding some Pascal names, then we can identify, okay, it's a function name. So that way we should always have a uniform method of writing test codes rather than having a variety of writing naming conventions, right? And the test cases should be descriptive. So if we come across Cypress or WebDriver IO, they suggest a proper format as to how we should define our it blocks. So it should always start with should allow whatever actions we want to do. We want to do some type actions, we want to do sign in, sign up. So those kind of things should be more descriptive so that, because at the same time, those kind of informations will be shared to the stakeholders, team members, team managers. Therefore, they should be able to understand what we are trying to achieve in that particular test cases, right? So we should always follow a proper naming convention and make sure whatever we are writing comes under a standard industry standard practices, and at later point of time those kind of things will be easily maintained, and we can easily achieve good quality within our automation specs. Now, streamlining Cypress test with test splitting. So during my initial career phase, so when I was starting with the automation testing, what I was doing was I was writing all the lengthy codes, 100 and 200 lines of codes, which was not adding some value to my automation specs, because the larger the test code, the more chances of being flaky and more chances of being failure. So instead of writing 100 to 200 lines of code, what we can do is we can split the test cases into multiple forms. So we can have maybe 10, 20 lines of code in a one block, because if you're having a small number of test cases, it allows for easier, faster feedback. We can easily manage that. And at the same time, if you need to do maintenance, if you need to update anything within this particular method or actions we want to do, it can be easily updated. So it is always a best practice to divide the test cases into the smaller blocks rather than writing large number of blocks. Yeah. So this is the example where we have, so initially, this is the suggested example. The initial example would be something like we're having one it block where we are doing login, we are doing some actions, we are doing some payments, and then we are doing the logout. So those are all things in a single it block might results in flaky test cases, right? So instead we can use different kinds of hooks, or we can divide the test cases into smaller pieces, smaller chunks, so that we can have a clear visibility as to what are the test cases doing and how we can further improve it, right? So splitting the test cases helps to debug and update the test suits very easily. So it is always a best practice to write test suits not more than 20 test cases unless it's necessary. We can use different ways. We can use hooks. We can define methods. If we are to use recurring methods or recurring actions, we need to do. So the next one is optimizing input management in Cypress. So when we are using automation, we use a lot of input data, test data, to make sure we are performing the correct action. So suppose we are doing writing, we're typing into the input box, or we are doing some actions. So we need to make sure we are passing the proper input. And And in Cypress, so basically, as you can see, whenever we do typing, so we just use the selectors and we type dot type and we do whatever typing we need to do. We simply pass the value that is static. It's not dynamic. Not dynamic actually. It's always static, hard coded into the selectors. But instead of doing that, what we can do is we can have a constant file where we will manage all the selectors. So suppose there is a pop-up. Suppose you have done some actions, you have done some deletion, you have done some addition. There will be a pop-up action, pop-up present. So the pop-up might be your actions performed successfully or deletion successfully done. So those kind of things can be kept in a single place rather than hard coding in a data, because at the same time, those kind of input data might be reused multiple specs. So rather than hard coding in a test specs, what we can do is we can create a constant file. So for that, we can use Cypress fixtures that provides us easy readability, and we can easily import that. Or at the same time, what we can do is we can come up with a constant file. We can define, suppose if it is input, we can write input.js or input.ts, and we can write all the input data that are required for the Cypress automation. Maybe it might be related to usernames, maybe it might be related to adding an item, deleting an item, maybe some kind of success message. So all those things can be managed in a single place. So that way, the advantage would be it creates a centralized storage, because at later point of time during development, we might keep on updating our error messages, or we might keep on updating our input data. So if we are writing it in a central place, the updation will be done in one place and the changes will be reflected in multiple places. So basically, it will save a lot of time when we are doing development. And whenever there is CI/CD, whenever we are integrated with the CI/CD development, we need to make sure those kind of practices are followed, because small error in input management, or a small error in any type of test specs might result in CI deployment delay. So we need to make sure like we are managing our input properly and it is understandable at the same time. So in the examples, if you see cy.get username dot type username. So by this way, I can easily understand, okay, I'm typing username, I'm typing password. So, and also the advantage of using constant file is, so suppose you're typing username, or you might be typing passwords. So those kind of things, if they are kept in constant, it won't be visible to the runner or in the logs. So it's always a best practice to make sure the constant files are hidden. Constant files are kept in a separate place. So ditching cy.contains for more efficient queries. So while starting getting with the Cypress, I was always confused with how to use cy.contains, how to use cy.gates, what's the difference, because the actions performed by cy.gate and cy.contains are always similar, right? They whatever we want, they will get that particular selectors, they'll get that element, and we can do whatever actions we want, maybe in terms of type, maybe in terms of click. So, but what is the difference between cy.contains and cy.get? So basically, cy.contains, what it does is it does partial text matching. So suppose in a UI, you are trying to create a create new button, right? So while you are trying to create new button and you do contains, so it will check for the element text. And suppose if that is placed in two different places, then cy.contains will fail, because cy.contains always expect that particular text to be unique. And if it is not unique, it will fail with the failure, as in like duplicate element found or something of that sort, right? So instead of that, what we can do is, it's always a good practice to use cy.get, because it reduces flakiness to a whole lot extent. And at the same time, instead of get, we can use some other chaining of commands to make sure we are using efficient queries and efficient selectors is being used, right? And there is one example we can see, cy.get button container dot contains button dot click. So what I've done is, so I'm getting that particular selector, and within that selector, I'm checking if that selector contains text button or not. If it contains button, I'll be clicking it. So in this way, I'll have a more robust select click actions that will first get the selectors, check for the value, and do the click action. So that way it reduces flakiness rather than writing the cy.contains button dot click. And another way of using cy.contains that most of the people are unaware of is cy.contains provides us option with writing the selectors as well as text name, and we can do whatever actions. So rather than writing cy.contains button, what we can do is cy.contains hash button container. We are passing the ID tag and we are passing the name value, and we're doing the click. So in this way, what it will do is cy.contains button name. First, it will get the button container, and then it will check whether that button container contains value cy.contains. and then it will click. So either way, you can use cy.get contents, or you can use contents with selectors and the value and do the actions. But it is always a best practice to avoid cy.contents button.click, because it really increases flakiness in the test code, and at the same time, the flakiness might cause some issue with the automation specs to fail. So it is always best practice to make sure you use a consistent way of writing selectors. Using timeout over wait in Cypress. So as we all know, in Cypress, the execution, during execution, sometimes we might want to wait. There might be some events that requires 10 seconds, 15 seconds to complete, then only we can do some other actions, right? So in that case, instead of doing wait, so the problem of doing wait is wait will basically halt the execution. Suppose you are doing wait with, you are going further, you are visiting some websites, and after that you are clicking some actions. But before that, you are trying to wait for 20 seconds. So the 20 seconds, it will halt the entire execution, and sometimes it might lead to failure, or it might lead to or Chromium crash in case of excess memory usage, right? So it's always a best practice if we use timeout, because timeout gives us a precision control. So in the example, you can see I'm trying to visit a website, and after visiting the website, I'm trying to check for the input type text, and I'll wait for 10 seconds. So in the timeout 10 seconds, if I'm getting the element before 10 seconds, it will execute the code. If it is not getting within, so it will wait till 10 seconds. And if it is not getting after 10 seconds, it will fail. So the basic advantage of using cy.wait over timeout, of cy.timeout over wait is the timeout would wait for the selectors to complete, for the actions to complete, rather than waiting the entire execution. Okay, so it's always a best practice to not use cy.wait, because at the same time, it reduces the performance of your specs. If you're waiting 20 seconds, it will wait, it will increase the 20 seconds execution time. So it's always a best practice to use timeout instead of wait. So this is one of the advanced topic that has been introduced in the Cypress, that is clock and tick for API interception. As we know, Cypress being a UI automation tool, we can perform API testing as well. And we can play around with the APIs. We can send requests, we can mock the APIs, we can spy the APIs. But at the same time, what happens is while we're doing some UI testing, the same API can be called multiple times, right? And what Cypress does is, suppose we have defined cy.intercept for the some APIs, and we're trying to check for the API response. So cy.intercept, and that API has been called 2-3 times. Okay, now 2-3 times. So what happens is, when we are doing it, when we want the response of the third APIs, like the same APIs, but we want the response for the third time, the Cypress will always return the first response. It won't get the third response. So in that case, we can play around with the clock and tick to make sure we are getting the expected response. I'll show you a short example as to how we can implement clock and tick. So this is the simple implementation of using clock and tick in our Cypress. So the first command, cy.clock and cy.tick. So basically, I'll just explain what clock and tick does is, cy.clock and tick will hold the execution. It will time forward our execution. So in the case of first example, cy.clock and cy.tick, so my execution will move 1 second ahead. And in the same case, again, if I'm using cy.tick, it will move 1 second ahead. So suppose within that time frame, within that 1 second, if some execution is done, if some API is being called, that will be neglected, and the new response will be taken after 1 second. Okay. So in this one, I want to intercept /API/data, and the request is get, and I'm waiting. And after clicking button actions, I want to check for the response. So what I've done is I have clicked 2 times. So after second time, I need to get the latest response, not the first button click action response. If we are not using click, clock and tick, it will get the first API response, and you won't be getting the fresh response. So if you're using clock and tick, now it will wait. You use clock, it will wait for the API to call. It finds the API. You have clicked the button. Now it will move your execution 1 second ahead. So within that time frame, if some API has been called, it will be neglected. And again, you have clicked that button. Again, it will skip you have used cy.tick 1000. So it will wait, it will skip the 1 second into whatever actions, maybe there are some API calls. So that will be neglected and it will move our response to 1 second ahead. Now, cy.get data will get the second button click action response rather than first click action response. So in this way, we can use clock and tick. So to get the latest API response, as currently the Cypress does not support within the intercept to get the latest API response. So this can be a workaround if you are playing around with the API testing and you want to get the latest response. So this can be a little tricky. You can have a look at it once, but the implementation of clock and tick for API interception is pretty good. And that way we can achieve whatever response we want with the clock and tick. So coming to ESLint, Husky, and for Cypress for improved code quality. So most of you have already heard about ESLint, Husky, Prettier. So there are a lot of advantages. So previously, while I was working for a company, there we were not using any kind of Husky or ESLint. So the problem was my colleagues were writing code in their format. I was writing code in some other format. And maybe he was giving semicolon, I was missing semicolon, he was using single quotes, I was using double quotes. So those kind of issues were there and we were not having a consistent code, right? So if it is a large number of team members, suppose you are working with QA team of 10 to 15 team members, then you can find a variety way of writing test cases. So instead, to overcome that issue, we can use ESLint, Husky, and Prettier. So what it does is, so basically ESLint provides certain rules. So if you are using ESLint, we can set certain rules as to, suppose you have defined a variable like const a and you haven't used it. So if you're using ESLint, it will throw an error as in const a is defined but never used. Please remove it from the code. So those kind of errors, those kind of messages, we'll have to make sure our code is using the best practices, and at the same time the code quality will also be improved. And basically the idea of using Husky is whenever we are doing any push to branch or whenever we are committing, it will check entire test specs and it will check for the whatever rules we have set in the ESLint, it will check it against that. And there are certain rules that has been defined by the Cypress, like avoiding usage of cy.wait, avoiding usage of undeclared variables. So those kind of issues can be predefined before pushing it to branch, right? So that way the peer-to-peer code review is also reduced. At the same time, they can only focus more on functionality aspect rather than checking for the code quality. So proper uses of ESLint, Husky, and Prettier in our Cypress framework can make sure our code quality is of top notch, and at the same time, it is uniform across the test specs. Setting of environment config in Cypress. So whenever we are doing testing, so we never do testing in only one environment. There are multiple environments. There can be staging, there can be sandbox, there can be production. So while we're working with multiple environments, we run our automation in those environments as well. So we need to make sure like we are able to run our automation in multiple environments, and whatever issues are present in those kind of environments can be found beforehand and fixed, right? Because whatever changes are pushed to development after sandbox, those sandbox changes will be pushed to production. So we need to make sure sandbox is always up to date and there are no errors in sandbox. So in order to make sure we are running our automation framework in multiple environments, by default, Cypress provides only one config, that is cypress.config.js, which we can use for only one base URL. Like if you're using only that, we will be able to do it for only one environment, but we can do a little tweak and we can add multiple environments as I have shown you in the example. So here we have added 3 different environments: production, staging, and test.json. So these are my 3 different environments. And I have added all the base URLs, reporter types, what are the environments, and the timeout and the base timeout issues. All those things will be configured in each and every JSON file. And from that JSON file, I can use get config by file plugin. So that what it will do is, so whenever I type any command, like based on the config file, so I have defined a config file as staging. So from staging.json, it will pick all the configuration file, my base URL, my timeouts, whatever I have set in staging.json, it will be pulled and the base URL will be set according to that, and we can start execution. So that way we can achieve execution in multiple environments. So this is really an important way to implement multi-environment testing. So this is one of the way. There are other ways also, but this is a pretty easy and neat way to implement multiple environment testing. So coming to hooks, so hooks is really important coming to Cypress. So while doing automation testing previously, many of my team members, they were writing all the test cases in each block only. So what we can do is, what is the advantage of using after those kind of hooks is like, whatever certain actions are there, if they are common within our test specs, we can write it in the hooks rather than defining it in the test blocks. Suppose we have 20 lines of code in a test block, and first 5 lines are common without the test cases within the test specs, right? So we can pull out that 5 test specs. We can keep it in before or before each or after each, whichever hook is suitable for us. And we can simply reduce the number of lines of code that we use that is present in the it block. So that way it creates maintainability of the code, and at the same time the readability is also increased. And whatever issues are found, suppose if there is some issue with the before each, we'll get a pre-response in the Cypress test runner, and we can easily fix that. So the proper uses of hooks in Cypress is really important. And if you're using that, we can make sure like our it blocks are consistent, and whatever issues are there, they can be easily identified. Maybe it is in respect to before each hooks, or maybe in terms of it blocks, we can easily identify that. Optimizing test using test suites and tags. So in Cypress, so initially, what happened was I was writing the automation specs, and I needed to run certain test specs that are common. So maybe I had like 10 different specs, and out of 10 different specs, I had 3 different specs that were related to payment. Now I want to run only the payment related specs. The one way is doing is going to terminal, writing all the specs one by one, executing. So that takes a lot of time. Or another one is using overheaded mode and going to the runner and executing one by one. But instead of that, what I did was I added a tag that is @cart. So as you can see in the describe block, we need to add a tag. So by adding the tag, I have segregated what kind of test cases are those. Okay, so if it is a payment specs, if it is related to payment, if it is related to maybe purchase, maybe onboarding, or maybe login, so we can give a tag, individual tag to each and every describe or context, and based on that we can run. Now, if you can see npx cypress run env grep @cart. So doing that, it will pull all the describe that is having tag cart, and it will run that. So by that way, so similarly, for the payment test cases, so if I am doing that, so I'll be able to pull out all the test cases at once and execute it at one time rather than doing it manually every time. So using tags properly is really important. If the number of specs keeps on growing, so it is really important to use tags. Using comments. So comment is also one of the important part, because whenever you are doing new organization or any new QA members have joined an organization, they might not be familiar with the code. So if there are any complex code that you are writing, or maybe there are some complex test cases that you have written, we can add certain comments to make sure it is easily understandable and readable to the other team members. So it is always a best practice to make sure comment is being added. That way, if in future manager or any stakeholders needs to check the code, they can easily understand, okay, this particular thing is doing this. So that all readability is achieved from the comments. So it's always a good idea to use comments within the specs. So I think this is the last slide from my end. Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful session and thank you for the presence. And I would like to hand over to Madhusudan.
Okay, I think I unmute. Sorry, guys. Thank you all for fantastic session today. It was insightful. Explore how Cypress and based on industry practice can enhance QA automation. Especially thanks to our speaker, People Pant. for their valuable insight. Let's apply what we have learned and embrace this practice in our project. So, but this time is for question and answer sessions. So we have questions from the participants. So we will take one by one in given time frame. So from participants, one question is how can Cypress handle asynchronous operation and waits, people?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So basically, the asynchronous operations are automatically handled in Cypress, because what Cypress does is, you might have seen the execution is, whenever we're executing in the Cypress test runner, so all the before executing the next line, it will wait for the API or any events to complete, and after that is completed, it will only execute the other events or other actions that we are trying to do. So Cypress does that automatically by using intelligent wait commands. So it will simply wait for the API response to complete or some kinds of events to complete, which reduces the need for explicit wait. So if you are going for the Selenium, we need to use explicit and implicit wait to make sure like that particular operations is being completed, then only we can move it to another one. But with the Cypress, that is automatically handled, and yeah, pretty much that.
Okay. One another questions from participants. Are there any tips for maintaining scalable and maintainable test suites with Cypress?
Okay, yeah, certainly. So as I previously mentioned, so whatever I have mentioned, those can be key practices to create a scalable automation framework. And at the same time, there are some other key practices that we can follow. Maybe we can keep our test cases independent, so that later at point of time when we are going for the parallelization, we can easily achieve that. And removing unnecessary dependencies using pace object model, or creating a reusable functions that can be reused inside entire specs. And also Cypress provides a lot of plugins to various actions, so we can reuse that to make sure our framework is scalable.
Okay, people, and one another questions from participants Ashish Shrestha. How to handle the specific scrolling, not whole page in a web page?
Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay.
for that, Cypress provides two different ways. One is scroll into view, another one is scroll. Okay. Now there can be a lot of tweaks that we can do. Suppose you want to do scroll to a particular element, right? Now, instead of scrolling to that particular element, you can scroll to any element that is above that or below that. So that way it will keep the viewport in exact that particular selectors which you want to do. So suppose you want to scroll to a selector C, but above that there are A, B, and there are B and E. So what you can do is you can either scroll to B or you can scroll to A. So that way it will be visible within the viewport. If you are directly scrolling to that particular element, that might fail, but you should always try to scroll one element above or any element close to that. So that way we can make sure we are being scrolled properly.
Okay, thanks. I think clear. And one other another one questions from Prahlad Shrestha. So he asked, people, I sent one syntax or command in your chat box, please. He asked.
Yeah, so Cypress cy.tick and clock is not only for API interception. We can do it for a lot of actions. So maybe you're downloading a file, right? And the download won't happen instant. It's like it might take another 5 to 10 seconds. So what you can do is cy.clock and then cy.tick, you can wait for 10 seconds. It will move the execution to 10 seconds ahead. And then you can do whatever options. You can check whether the file has been downloaded successfully or not. So the applications of using cy.tick and clock is not only limited to Cypress intercept, but can be used to other ways also.
Okay, thanks. I think clear, Prahlad Shrestha. If you have any questions, participants, please ask and through the chat. Okay, one another questions from the Saka Nirola is, I want to learn about the QA automation and I know nothing in this field. What tips would you like to give for beginner like me?
Okay, So basically, the first idea would be identifying the roadmap, because without having the proper roadmap, we won't reach a destination. So first of all, you need to identify, if you are really interested into the automation, you need to identify which automation you want to start with, because in the current industry, we can come across 5 or 6 different automation tools. So for that, you can use roadmap.sh. That will provide an excellent way of identifying which automation tool you can use and what are the ways of achieving, what are the ways of understanding those particular frameworks. Or at the same time, you can use Test Automation University, that is TAU. So TAU provides us guidelines as to how we can go along with the Cypress framework. So if you are confident with Java, it will suggest based on that. So it might suggest Selenium. If you are confident with JavaScript, TypeScript, so it will suggest maybe in Playwright, WebDriver IO based on the based on your knowledge. So I feel basically creating a roadmap and connecting with maybe seniors and watching some YouTube videos related to roadmaps would be a great idea.
Okay, I think it clear. So just we have limited time to question and answer session, so we can only pick one last questions from the Ashish participants side. While testing e-commerce site in product page, do we need test whole product or just single product? Because there will be lost of products. Can I repeat? While testing e-commerce site in product page, do we need to
Yeah,
test
I got
whole
it.
product or
Maybe
just single
taking
product?
example of Taraz, right?
Yeah.
So product can be, so basically the product can be categorized, right? So if you are doing automation for based on the product wise, you can select, okay, you can automate one from the electronics categories, you can automate one from the mobile categories. So at the same time, what we can do is we can make that dynamic, more dynamic. We can use test data, we can pass multiple values like multiple products name and whatever actions we want to do. So based on that, it will perform. But the ideal case would be picking one product or two products from each categories and automating that, because we can have an assumption as to if one product is working fine for a particular in the particular categories, it will work fine for other product as well. So you can do automation based on the categories rather than product based.
Okay. We will pick one last questions. That is interesting questions. Kusal ask why not Selenium over Cypress? And participant, this will be the last questions from our side. Okay.
Yeah,
People.
sorry. Yeah. So going over Selenium or Cypress is personal preference, I would say. And if you are coming across, if you are really starting from the scratch, I would suggest everyone to look for Cypress, because Cypress comes with a lot of features. You can go time traveling. So in Selenium, you cannot do time traveling. Suppose you want to see, I have written this lines of code, what are these doing? So if you need to check in that way, then Cypress is really good. In Selenium, as I previously mentioned, all the asynchronous command, asynchronous waits will be managed by Cypress automatically. But in Selenium, you have to do it manually. You have to use implicit, explicit wait, and that might work, that might not work, right? And Selenium comes with the support. Sorry, Cypress comes with the support. Comparing to the previous years, right now the Cypress community is growing very fast, and we are getting updates every month. So I feel using Cypress or Selenium is personal preference. But if you are starting with the fresh mindset, I would like you to suggest to go for the Cypress because of its features that are not present in Selenium.
Okay. Thanks, people. That was the last question from the participant side, and there is some remaining questions. So our time bounding, we cannot pick all the questions from the participants. So as we conclude today's webinar, I want to express my gratitude to all the participants who join us. Before we wrap up, I kindly request to take a moment to respond to our impact poll. So your feedback is invaluable to us in improving our future webinars. So